y'all, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Vashti Sarah, and you are listening to All the Things, where we literally talk about all the things. So in today's episode, we have Ellie, a returning guest, who will be talking about her story that involves a divorce that was led by a heavy porn addiction. She goes in depth with what that story looks like, but also very honoring towards her ex-husband. So I highly recommend listening to this episode. Share it with a friend, share it with a family member, whoever it may be, because it's important to talk about the realities and the detriment of what porn can do, or how detrimental porn can be within not just your marriage relationship, but also any relationship. And to nip that in the bud sooner rather than later. We'll also have a giveaway in this episode, where we'll be giving away one of Ellie's books. Yes, she wrote a book titled Unfaithful, regarding her journey walking through that process, helping other women and men when it comes to porn addiction and what that looks like in a relationship. But before we jump into today's episode, let's talk about our sponsor for today. Our sponsor is Every Life Diaper Company. You know that I talk about them all the time. I love them. I love that they don't have fragrances, that my baby loves their diapers. They haven't had any rash, or she hasn't had any rash, or any type of reaction to their diapers. They have a subscription service. They have diapers and wipes. We just love everything about Every Life. We love that they're pro-life and that they're a Christian company. So use my code VASHTI10, that is VASHTI10, for 10% off your first order. VASHTI10 for 10% off your first order. Now, let's get into today's episode. All right, y'all, we're back again with another episode of All the Things, and we have Ellie, who's returned. In the last episode that we had her on, I accidentally pronounced her name wrong, so we got it right this time. This week's episode, however, is a little bit more, well, I won't say a little bit more. It's very serious. It's a topic that I feel needs a lot of addressing when it comes to not just the topic of pornography, but pornography in marriage, and how detrimental it can be, not just for the wife or the husband, whoever struggles with it, but the marriage entity on a whole. So Ellie, you're no stranger. You were here just a couple, when this episode will post, you were here last week. So just go ahead and give another brief introduction of who you are, and then we'll jump into your story, just an overall synopsis of your story.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be back. I had such a great time last time. And so I was here before because I was talking about Rescue Her, which is an anti-trafficking nonprofit that I work at in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas. We had mentioned a little bit of my story then. And so, I wrote a book. It's called Unfaithful, and you can find it on Amazon. And I wrote this because I was married and my ex-husband had a pornography addiction. And as I walked through that process, I learned a lot. Mm-hmm. And this is a very common thing now, unfortunately, that's happening in a lot of marriages. And after my divorce, I really felt like God said, hey, write about your story for other women who are going through the same thing. So I did, and it has already been so impactful. And I have just been so blessed by the women who have reached out and said, I feel this way too. I've struggled with this, and I found a lot of hope in your story. And that's the goal, right? That there's hope on the other side of the pain. So just in short, I had met my ex-husband in college, and we started dating, and he was amazing. He was my best friend, but he struggled with a porn addiction. Okay. And I did not understand in my youthful naivety and innocence, what that entailed. And he had actually overcome other addictive substances. And to me, it seemed like the same thing. If he had overcome those, he could overcome this. And, it seemed like it would be easy. And because he wanted to grow and change, then to me, I feel like I married the potential and not the pattern of who he was. And so I saw who he could be, right? And not the reality of the situation. Yeah, because there was so much good in him. And I think that's the hard part. And so after a few years of marriage, we ended up kind of just at our wits' end, and finally went to counseling, and we can get more into that in a little bit. But basically my counselor advised me, she said, I've never told anyone this, but I think you need to separate and get some objectivity.
Wow.
And so I went back and lived with my parents. Yeah. And went back and lived with my parents and stayed with him and drove back to visit him for counseling once a month for a year. And at that point, he just was not changing. And to me, and I think everyone's story is different, but for me, that was a pretty good indicator that he wasn't going to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There was no plan to change.
yeah. And so we went through the divorce and I went through a lot of healing. And yeah, God has just been incredible. Yeah.
Wow. Wild, wild story. But
Yeah.
before we move into the nitty gritty of it, I wanted to mention my husband listened to last week's episode on rescue her and sex trafficking.
Mhm.
And he told me, he said, Vashti, men in particular, or boys in particular, get introduced to pornography very, very young. And I'm sure that
Yeah.
age is a lot sooner. But for him, I believe it was 11 or 12 years old. And there is locker room talk. If you play sports, that's what all the boys talk about. And he remembered in class, they just mentioned one thing and his curiosity sparked. And, one of the guys were like, hey, do you do blah, blah, blah? And he's like, I don't know what that is. And he grew up Christian, very sheltered. So he went home and curiosity sparked it. But he told me, he's like, it's a very, very young age that you get introduced to this, especially as a male. But not only that, he didn't know that with sex trafficking, porn was one of the main factors of that. And
Right.
his eyes, was open. And he said if more men viewed pornography, it as disgusting as it is, but more so these women, these children are being trafficked. He feels like outside of this is a sin, it would push them to steer away from it because you know, I, it's appealing to the eye, especially for a male. Male are visually driven, but if they only see it as okay, it's not just a Christian thing. We don't want you to watch porn. It's a moral thing. It's deeper than that. Well, not deeper than sin because sin is the deepest thing. But, if they could only look at it from that perspective,
Mhm.
hopefully that would get them to steer away from it. But yeah, my husband's eyes were open. He's like, I didn't realize that sex trafficking had so much to do with pornography,
Mhm.
and how disgusting it is to its core. But just as an encouragement to what you guys are doing, like you're opening people's eyes daily on the gravity of what this is. But let's talk about the initial signs and the moments when you realized that porn
Mhm.
was impacting your marriage and your relationship with your ex-husband.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Definitely. I think a lot of people don't realize the connection. And when I had first found out that my ex-husband struggled with pornography, I did a lot of research on it, trying to understand that it wasn't about me and really learning. And that's really when my eyes were opened to
Yep.
how much porn and sex trafficking are connected, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think my story is a little unique in the sense that I hear often about women who have been married for 20 years and then discover that their husbands watch porn. And that is a horrifying, traumatic thing in itself, I think, to be
Yeah.
married that long.
Wow.
But I knew about it while we were dating. And so I think it's just a little bit different in the sense that I didn't understand what I was getting into. And, I thought we could just overcome it. And so what happened was that as we were married, he would watch porn, and then instead of coming to me initially and saying, hey, I have these thoughts, I have this temptation, I'm struggling, I want to watch it, he would watch it and then he would come to me and confess. And so I
Got it.
thought he was being honest the whole time
Yeah.
because I was like, wow, he's telling me that he watched it, he's not hiding it. And
Yeah.
a counselor later said, that's not honesty. If it were honesty, he would tell you the moment he struggled with a thought, you know and not let it get that far. And so I think what that did over time is that it caused a repeated trauma, because
Mhm.
he would come to me, he would be upset about it genuinely. But the nature of addiction is that you do what you hate.
Right. Yeah.
And so he would do that over and over. And so over and over, I had this infidelity, right? Because to me, pornography is infidelity. It's doing the same thing that cheating with a person, in real life is doing to my heart as his wife. And
Yep.
so, yeah. And so it was this repeated trauma over and over of this happening. And, we would talk and I would forgive him and we would move on, but I didn't understand the things that were happening beneath the surface and the ways
Right.
that was subconsciously traumatizing me because I thought on the surface, honestly, that I was handling it okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this
And
was
so
all during dating, not marriage yet.
this was both. This was through dating
Okay.
and marriage. And it was just basically, yeah, that's a good question. It was basically the same cycle throughout the whole thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then we moved on to implement things like no technology access for him. And
Mhm.
so I would have all the passwords and things. And I think, and every story is different, that for some people that's enough and that works. But for us, he had a
Yeah.
super heart issue. And, you know, it
Mhm.
was born out of a trauma. He had kids say some horrible things to him when he was young that
Mhm.
caused a wound in his heart. And then when he discovered porn accidentally in a magazine, it was, oh, it made him feel good. And so
Yeah.
now there's something to make him feel good to deal with the
Yeah.
pain in his heart. And so it was just caused this cycle, you know? And so in the book, I'm very intentional to honor him in the sense that, yes, he made bad choices and it doesn't justify his choices, but he's also a broken and hurting person. And we do a lot of things out of our pain that aren't good. And so, you know, knowing that that wound in his heart had caused that cycle, I think was helpful to understand, although it doesn't excuse his actions for sure.
Yeah, and that's what I was
But
gonna
yeah, so
ask. Was there any
mhm,
trigger to it? And I, like you said, a lot of the times the reason why we do what we do, especially negative or wrong things, is because or it stemmed from childhood trauma. And like you said, it doesn't excuse it, but it does explain why. And
mhm,
I even asked my husband. I never struggle with a porn addiction. I know women do. I know plenty of women that do. But I
yeah,
asked him, you know, from a male's perspective, why, you know, why do men and women, but why do men specifically are so drawn to it? And he told me, one, we're visually stimulated, but two,
mhm,
like you mentioned, a lot of boys, especially quiet boys, growing up, they get teased in school, and or girls aren't attracted to them, or they're not
mhm,
getting attention, and this is an outlet and a release to feel good just for the moment. And then that
right,
moment doesn't last forever. So it's a repeated cycle over and over and over. And until you, one, find the Lord, I mean, you can break it, I'm sure, without the Lord, but then you find something else to become an addiction. It's not
mhm,
truly attacking the core issue. But, you know, he told me, one, finding the Lord, but also learning not coping mechanisms, but different ways to, once those thoughts come up, you dismiss them immediately. And again, that can only be that strength, that supernatural strength is found in the Lord.
mhm. Yeah, for sure.
But
I mean, and one of the ways that men have talked about overcoming a pornography addiction is through finding new habits.
yeah,
Because pornography in the brain is literally as addictive as cocaine, the way that it works in the brain. And
mhm,
so, you know, we have
yeah,
these neural pathways in our brains that cause habits, that build habits. And so when we watch pornography, it's building a pathway in our brain. And so when we can implement other activities, so let's say in response to the pain or the stress, instead of watching porn, we go play golf or read a book,
mhm,
or go hang out with healthy people, right? We're building new pathways. So
mhm,
it's definitely possible to
yeah,
overcome, but it causes so much damage to begin with that, you know, it's definitely better to catch it
yes.
early.
Or yeah, earlier versus than later. And one of the big things he says for a lot of men, that their outlet,
Hmm.
or to combat that, at least with the red pill type of mentality, is working out, going to the gym,
Hmm.
releasing
Yeah,
in a different form, which is
right.
good. It's a good way
Yeah,
to combat that.
that's good.
So, how would you describe the challenges and difficulties that y'all face with porn in marriage?
Yeah, I think it was difficult because, you know, I loved him. He was my best friend. We got along really well in a lot of ways. And I really considered have a good marriage in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
But his pornography use, you know, caused an underlying distrust. And
yeah,
so, you know, our sex life struggled and other things struggled because we weren't bonding and connecting the way that we should have because I
yeah,
didn't fully trust him. And at the time, I
mhm,
would have said that I did. I didn't realize it, but looking back on it, you know, I could see that there were, yeah, things that came up and problems that were caused because of that. Um,
right,
and so, you know, when it comes to the Bible and marriage, there's covenant, and there's a covenant between a man and a wife. And
Mhm.
so when you invite pornography into the bedroom or into one person's thoughts, then I believe that's a breach of covenant. And so
Yeah.
again, that's, it's another thing that's messing with the marriage. When you're supposed to be a team and bonded in unity, then that's yeah, breaching that.
Yeah. And two, you're introducing a spirit within your home, and especially your bedroom is one of the most sacred place.
Yes.
And you're introducing, even if it's virtual, you're introducing another person in that
Right.
bedroom. And the Bible is very clear that if you look at another woman or another person lustfully, you're committing adultery in the heart. You're cheating on
Exactly.
your spouse. Wow.
Yeah, and it's
And
so much of this is a heart issue. Yeah, it's not even like any legalistic thing. It's a heart issue. It's,
yep.
where am I at with my spouse and what's going on? And, almost every person who watches porn, they're watching it to deal with something, to deal with stress, to feel better about their lives. And a lot of people might get hooked on it early just as kids, but yeah, and so there's usually, a reason, especially like that, to just stop watching it because it's not a healthy way to deal with things anyway.
Mhm. And was he honest in saying, "I know this is a struggle, I'm working on it"? Was it more, and I don't wanna, because 'cause you're very honoring to him, which I completely respect. A lot of women don't honor their spouse after infidelity of any kind, after any type of wrongdoing, but that's big of you for still honoring him in your book and in the way you speak about him. But was it, I don't wanna say lip service, but it was just mainly, "I'm telling you what you want to hear," or did you think he genuinely knew he struggled with it, was trying to combat it, but it was just too much of a big fight with flesh?
Yeah, that's a great question. And no, I do genuinely believe that he wanted to fight it. I think what happened is that he put in the surface work and he did
Yeah,
try to a degree. And then when it got to the deep stuff, that's where he didn't want to deal with it anymore. And that's where he started to almost run away. And I had read the book Wild at Heart by John Eldridge, which is an incredible book. Love that
mhm,
book. It really helped me to understand men too, and how they think, and helped me in my healing process. There was a part in there though where it talks about that, where men, sometimes will run away from their courage, and they'll run away from the things that hurt them, and we all do that. And so I really just believe that it was, he had been addicted to this since he was a child, and
wow,
so yeah, so his entire life, this was something that was familiar to him, and I think
mhm,
that honestly, I believe it terrified him to walk away from it. And again, that
yeah,
doesn't excuse his choices, but it does help explain, and it helped me to have a little bit more empathy, I think,
yeah,
toward his situation, to struggle with that since childhood. And then there are many men who do make that choice to walk away, and so my hope and prayer for him is that one day he still will.
mhm,
And we don't talk anymore, so I don't know how he's doing, but I do genuinely hope for the best for him because he has just so much potential, and there's so much purpose on his life that the enemy has tried to steal through this addiction.
yeah. Did counseling help at all, do you think?
It definitely helped me. I loved counseling. I think it was super beneficial. So how that worked is that during our marriage, neither of us really understood the importance of counseling. Honestly, we didn't understand. Like I thought we were handling it okay on our own, and so it wasn't until about 3 years into marriage, and at that point I was basically numb. And now I know that one of the trauma responses is just numbness. When you just don't know what else to do, you just kind of give up. And I didn't realize I was in that space, but I was having a conversation with my dad one day, and he was asking how things were going, and I'm pretty open with my parents, and so I was telling him, hey, we're doing okay, but I'm gonna call my ex-husband Daniel in the book, and so I said Daniel is struggling and his behaviors have increased in these ways, and my dad got really angry, and it kind of woke me up, and it made
Mm,
me realize, oh, I've been numb for a while, and I'm
wow,
not, yeah, and I'm not doing okay. And so after that, I was about to graduate with my master's degree, and we moved across the state to live with his parents, Daniel's parents. And I told him, you have no choice at this point. We have to go to counseling. Like, we've done everything we can do. I don't know what else to do. If you want to save our marriage, we have to do this. And so we got into couples counseling
yeah,
and individual, and I thought it was amazing. And honestly, that really progressed my healing. But that was the point where he would do it to a degree, and then he would fight it, and then he would quit, and we would try a different counselor, and he would do it to a degree, and then he would quit. And so um, I think it could have helped a lot had he been willing to do it. But I was learning in that season that he makes his own choices, and there was only so
Right.
much that I could do, and so I was going to just pursue my own healing. But I definitely recommend. I mean, two of the things that I've learned that I recommend for every couple is that if he's willing, that you get into counseling, and that he establishes healthy male accountability and other men in his life who will call him
Yeah.
higher, because I think that's really important and really, really healthy. Yeah,
Yeah. Do you think he just had a lot of walls up?
for sure. And yeah, he definitely did. And I think, I mean, as a believer, I think part of it was spiritual. There was a spiritual
Mm.
element to it in his life, but also just in general, addiction does things in the brain that can be pretty difficult to get through.
Yeah. And he was a Christian before y'all got married, correct?
Yes, he was.
Alrighty. Alrighty. And at what point in y'all's marriage did it affect intimacy? Because you mentioned this was prior to marriage, and then
Mhm.
3 years into marriage, that's when you were like, "Okay,
Right.
I'm at my wit's end, we're gonna go to counseling." At what
Yeah.
point within the marriage was intimacy just off the board where, it just affected it greatly?
Yeah, during that year of counseling, I would say, I mean, I was able to leave and get some objectivity, and I think that whole year that we were still married but going to counseling, yeah, that was affected then for sure.
And that's the year where you moved in with your parents, correct?
Yeah. So we
Okay,
were married for 4 years, but it was that last year that we were separated and going to counseling, and yeah.
got it. Okay. How would you describe your marriage overall outside of that, or did that affect it so much that it just wasn't really a great marriage per se?
Yeah, that's the wild thing to me because I can be such a black and white thinker, but during those
Mhm.
3 years before we separated, our marriage outside of that was great.
Wow.
He was, he's so funny and so kind and great with kids, and he was just my best friend, and so he had everything in him that I wanted in a husband, and I loved about him, and so I think that's why it was so complex and so difficult for me
Mhm.
to leave, and so it just had to get to that point where I was just miserable enough, in this issue. Um, so part of what changed is that when he and I were dating, I felt like the Lord told me to not get angry with him when he messed up and to just have grace.
Okay,
And so specifically for me, that was really important.
okay.
And so I just had grace with him, and I was never angry. And when we
Mhm.
got to that day where my dad and I had that phone call, I had nothing left to lose, and so I got angry. And so for the next 6 months or so, while I was finishing my program and before we moved and got counseling, I was just very angry, and I didn't know what to do. And I definitely don't advise that. I don't think it is, it doesn't help anything. But I just felt so lost, and I felt so confused because I could still laugh with him and have fun. And then I'd turn around and say, wait a minute, I'm angry with him and I don't understand. And it was just very confusing. And so I think a lot of women who are going through this feel that too. And they're in that season of just confusion because it's a relationship, and when I was talking about trafficking, a lot of trafficking can be complex because it's a relationship,
Right.
and it's a boyfriend, so to speak, pimp with the victim, and so it's complex. It's not just a bad guy and a victim, it's a
Yeah.
relationship. And so with my ex-husband, I loved him, and yet I was being hurt by his actions. Yeah.
Mhm. Do you think your grace somehow was disguised as you brushing things under the rug and suppressing things that when that day came, you lost it.
Yeah.
This is it.
I think that's a really good question. And no, I don't actually. I think that can often be the case. I
Yeah.
don't think that because I was pretty intentional to try to understand what was happening while it was happening. And you don't
Mhm.
know what you don't know. And so I've learned a lot since. And so now, I'm not going to walk into a relationship that has those flags.
Mhm.
But with him, I think I did the best that I could. And when it
Yeah.
got to the point where there was just, I fought for him a lot more than he fought for himself, and
Yeah.
so I've learned a lot about boundaries since then. And so, like in my book, I talk about healthy boundaries and what that looks like and what it means to actually forgive and not just brush things under the rug, but
Mm-hmm.
what that means with setting boundaries, and I talk about our value as women and what we mean to God, and a lot of stuff like that I went through is covered in there.
Yeah. Okay. Alrighty. Well,
Yeah.
let's talk about the breaking point. You mentioned your dad's conversation. Was that the breaking point where you realized this is where divorce is necessary? Or, what shifted things?
Yeah. So it was at the end of that year of counseling. We had
Mhm.
walked through counseling. I drove back once a month. We would go through it. I had my own appointments, all of this. And I told myself at the beginning, just an arbitrary number.
Mhm.
If at the end of 1 year he's not changed, I need to make a decision. And
Okay.
so it came up to the end of that year. And I remember meeting him in a coffee shop, and we sat there for 2 or 3 hours and just talked. And I felt so lost and confused, and I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want to make the wrong decision. And so I pulled
Yep.
into a parking lot crying after I left, and it was raining, and I'm sitting there by myself. And for the second time in my life, I heard the audible voice of God. I mean, nobody else was around. And I heard in my ear, "You can stay or you can go. I'm proud of you either way."
Oh,
And
got
yeah,
chills.
yeah,
Golly.
yeah. And I felt like that was the release that I needed in
Mhm.
order to walk away. And I want to be clear that God does not advocate for divorce. That is not something that He loves at all, but He allows for it because of the hardness of our hearts, right?
Yep.
And so it talks about that in the Bible, and there was infidelity involved. And so even in that situation, God didn't say, "Yes, get divorced." He said, "Yes, you have the choice."
Right.
And so, yeah. And so I prayed about it further, and talked to my parents, and I just really felt like that was what I needed to do in order to move forward and heal. Now, again, everybody has a different story, and for some women in this situation, it might be better to stay. But
Yeah.
if there's ever, excuse me, if there's ever abuse, I would say that's definitely a reason to separate.
Yep.
Even if you don't get divorced, because you need to be safe. And so, yeah, and so in my situation, I felt like divorce was what I wanted to do and what I needed for my personal recovery and health. And I want to clarify too, he was never physically abusive ever. It was just more that his porn use was an emotional abuse.
Right.
Um, yeah, and so we decided to do that, and he was actually incredible through the process, and he made it really easy, actually, and we were able to do that, and then I continued after the divorce with counseling, and with
Mhm.
healing. Yeah.
Did he You said he made it very easy, so did he not fight for the marriage?
No, he wanted to stay married, but I think there's just such a kindness in him as a person that he said, "Okay, if that's what you want, then that's what I'll do." Yeah,
Okay. Wow.
yeah, and
Wow.
again, makes it complex because there's so
Yeah,
much about him to love. Right.
exactly. Wow. Was there ever a point that you thought, "Okay, maybe a year was just too short. Maybe I'll give him another year."
I think at that point, it was enough, and I
Okay.
just had to make a decision that if he
Yeah.
wasn't going to change, at that point, losing his marriage, then I didn't know what else would do it.
Wow. If
Yeah.
that didn't open his eyes, the reality of, "Hey, this is it," then
Yes.
there's at least right now, there's no intention to change.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay. So
Yeah.
after the divorce or during the divorce, you had counseling, and I'm assuming after the divorce is finalized, you still went to counseling. At what point
Yes.
did you branch out and say, "You know what? I'm going to write a book about this. I'm going to share my story." And also with that was you said David is the name that you're using, correct?
Daniel. Mhm.
Daniel.
Mhm.
At what point or not at what point, was Daniel on board with this? Did he agree with it? And because I know you used a different name, but and you by no means have defamed him at all in our conversation. You've
Yeah.
been so sweet and very kind to honor him through the process, despite how messy it is. But what point did you decide to write a book, and was your ex-husband on board with it?
Yeah, so right around the time that I got divorced, I felt like the Lord just said, "Hey, write about it for other women." And so I had been journaling a lot, and so I started
Yeah.
that process. And it
Hmm.
took about 3 years between beginning to write it and publishing. And I moved during that time, took about 6 months off. But yeah, it
Yeah.
took about 3 years and a lot of hard work. And I did call him
Yeah.
before I started or around that time. And I said, hey, I'm going to do this. I'm going to give you a different name. Do you mind? Is that okay? And he was fine with it. Yeah. And again, that was my heart and my goal to
Wow.
honor him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which was
Huge,
pretty
because I feel like a lot of men or anyone in general, if you're writing about their story, even though you're using another name, the fact is people knew you were married. Your
yeah.
friends and family knew you were married. So you're writing
Mhm.
about the vulnerable details of your life. I'm sure other men and women, if they went through a similar issue, be like, no, absolutely not. Like, people will know, and that's not their thing to know. But the fact that he gave you the okay
Mhm.
is huge, and it shows his heart towards you. That, I mean, despite the marriage, he still loves you as a friend, and wants you
Right.
to heal. And if this is what was necessary to heal and to help other women and men out there, then
Mhm.
I don't know, that's huge of him. That speaks a lot about his character and personality.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. Yeah, and when it came to the name Daniel as well, I was praying about, Lord, is there a specific name that I should give him? And I heard the name Daniel come to mind immediately, and I was like, why that name? And so I looked it up, and I have this as a footnote in the book, but I looked it up, and the name Daniel means honor, and the one that I've chosen, and
Wow.
the one that the one that I have plans for, and all of these great things that I felt like God was saying to me, hey, I still love him, and he's still my son, and he still matters despite his
Yeah.
choices. Yeah. And
Wow.
so I love
That's
that. Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. It was really it was a really encouraging moment for me to, to hear the Lord's heart in that for him, despite his
Yeah.
choices. Yeah.
And you said it took you 3 years to write the book,
Mhm.
correct?
Yes. Yeah. And in that time I was going through counseling, I was still healing, and healing it's a process with layers. And so, everything that, in that time, brought different pieces of healing. And even now, I don't know if I mentioned this in the last episode, but I'm engaged. I'm getting married this May, which is really exciting. And even, yeah, and even being in that relationship, I knew would bring up things that it has. And it's been
Right.
beautiful to watch the Lord heal,
Mhm.
even different moments now,
Yeah.
so that I can walk through this. And so when I was going through the divorce, I remember in that counseling session, it was part of a church, and I remember meeting these women who were just full of like light and joy and amazing. And I remember sitting down and talking to one of them, and she had this crazy story and just trauma after trauma and all this stuff. And I was like, I
Wow.
never would have guessed that she went through all of that with how full of peace she was. And I
Yeah.
decided at that, this is what I want to look like. This is who I want to be. And I remember during the separation crying on the floor with the Lord and just not knowing what to do. And I remember distinctly having the choice. I can be bitter and angry, or
Yeah.
I can press in and I can ask God the really hard questions
Yeah.
and figure out what he has to say, right? And I'm so glad that that's what I did. And just yeah, and I feel like I'm walking in so much freedom and so much joy, and just the redemption of this new amazing man in my life, and the fact that we're getting married. I cannot believe the goodness of God. And when I was
Mhm.
in that season of pain, he kept telling me to keep moving and keep going because there was hope, and I'm like, now I'm in it. But at the
Yeah.
time I couldn't see it. And so part of my goal with this book is to tell women, hey, there's hope, that it's not going to be this painful forever. And God just has so much good for us that we can lean into, as we walk through that pain with him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's caveat a little bit here and talk about how were you able to open your heart again? You're engaged.
Mhm.
Congratulations. You're gonna be married
Thank
this year.
you.
How did you get to that point? And
Yeah.
I will say, you don't look like someone that wears sorrow. You don't look like you
Right.
wear
Yeah.
grief, or you're wearing, because you can tell sometimes individuals who have been through a lot because
For sure.
they haven't fully set free, and they keep
Right.
saying, well, this is me, I am divorced, I am this, I am depression, I am anxiety, versus saying,
Right.
I struggle with this, I struggle with that. They
Yeah.
wear the issue on them, and you don't. That redemptive story has shown through and through. So how have you gotten to this point, or at what point were you able to open your heart again and say, I'm ready for this?
Yeah. So I remember, so a lot of it had to do with counseling and just walking through healing, But I remember this one specific moment in counseling. And so it was an amazing program. And we would, I would tell her what was going on. And then we would walk through it and pray through it and just ask Jesus, what do you have to say about this? And so I don't usually hear God through visions and like pictures. I'm much more of, I hear him in different ways. And there's so many ways that we can hear God. He loves to speak to all of us differently. But in that season, in those sessions, I would get a lot of pictures. And so I remember sitting there and I was telling my counselor, I feel like I have to protect my heart. I don't know how to be open. And I don't know how to not feel like I have to guard it from him or, in general. And she said, okay, let's go through it. And so we did. And I remember sitting there and I got this picture out of nowhere. And it was like my heart was a ball and there was a brick wall around my heart. And then this beam of light shot out and it hit the wall and it knocked it down like dominoes. And I felt like the Lord said, I'm protecting your heart. You don't have to.
Wow.
Yeah. And so
again, chills all over my body. Wow.
Right. Yeah. And that moment has impacted me, I think, every day since. And every time that now I'm in a place, and that season was also diving deep in with the Lord and developing relationship with him and learning about his goodness and learning that he's trustworthy and that just because I walked through pain and that something bad happened doesn't mean that he's not good or that he doesn't love me, right? Because we live in a fallen world. There's a devil and he loves to steal, kill, and destroy. He loves to cause pain, but God does not, right? And so he never promised that life would be easy, but he does promise that he's good. Right. Mm-hmm. And that when we lean in and when we press in and when we spend time with him, my goodness, there's just so much that comes out of that. And so as I did that and as I pressed in and sought his face, he started to heal my heart. And so even now, when I go through moments where I'm vulnerable or scared or have that feeling like I need to protect my heart, I remember that moment and I say, Lord, I trust you. And I thank you that you're protecting my heart. And I'm going to be okay, and I lean in and I pray and I listen to his voice. And yeah, absolutely. The number one thing that got me through that was Jesus, for sure.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. I love when the Lord speaks to us. I specifically, ever since as a child, the Lord has always spoken to me in dreams and visions. And up to this day, I write down every single one of them. Not all my dreams, because some of them are oddball. I'm like, this is not from the Lord at all. Right. But there have been very impactful ones that I've written down, and I'm waiting. Some of them I'm waiting for it to come to pass, and some of them almost immediately. The Lord just has it happen as either as a warning or as an encouragement to someone, whatever it may be. But I just love hearing about how the Lord spoke specifically to you and very in detail, and in the moment you needed it. And I think that's an encouragement for whoever's listening. If you just dive in and just seek the Lord, he will speak to you. And his silence isn't him not speaking. His silence is a form of speaking as well. And we just need to humble ourselves and sit and wait in his presence and allow him to do what he needs to do.
Oh, yeah. And a big part of that, honestly, is learning how to hear his voice, because God speaks in so many different ways. And so one of the big things that I actually talk about in my book is that, and it's learning how to hear his voice and some different resources for that. Because honestly, when I was growing up for so long, I felt like I'm so left-brained. I don't know how to hear God. That doesn't make sense to me. And then I learned, and it made so much more sense, and that's, if prayer isn't just talking to God, it's a conversation. And so that means that, yes, we're talking to him, but we also have to know how to listen. So absolutely. That changed everything for me, learning how to hear his voice.
A million %. And it's not this shrine that you have to set up and all these different steps. It's very simple. It's very simple. Yeah. Alrighty. So now let's looking back. What are lessons that you've learned that you'd want to share with individuals who are experiencing a similar challenge, a similar situation? What are things that you would tell your younger you, to look out for?
Yeah, I think, first of all, if you're not married yet, definitely look at the patterns in a person's life, because they can say anything and they can have the potential. But if you don't if you ignore the patterns, then, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so definitely pay attention to that. And if you are married and this is something that you're struggling with, I would say, first of all, you can go to counseling. Even if he won't, get it for yourself, find the right counselor. That's the key, to make sure that I would recommend, obviously, as a believer, a spirit-filled counselor, someone who knows the Lord, who's going to be able to guide you in that way, and help, bring Jesus into it. And then if he's willing, I would say definitely get him into counseling as well. I think single and married together counseling is really important. And then also, if he doesn't have healthy male accountabilities in his life, get that, because he needs other men in his life to call him higher and to say things to him in a way that I can't, or you can't, as a woman and as a wife, right? Because our friends have a different role in our lives than our spouses. And sometimes we listen a little differently. Yeah. And then learn how to hear God's voice and just lean in, and I think this type of season and this type of pain is just so isolating, and it can be so difficult and makes us feel like we're on our own sometimes. And so find healthy community. If you don't have it, figure out how to develop it, find a good church, lean into that and find people that you can trust, because you cannot go through this alone, and you don't have to. There's so many resources out there now, and there's just so many great people who want to help, and so I think we often believe the lie that we're alone, and it's a lie. There's so many people who care, and there's a God who loves you. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And I also wanted to touch on the fact that ask the questions. If you are dating, ask those tough questions. That's something my husband and I did, prior to getting married, and something that I always said, I did not want to marry someone with a porn addiction, because I have seen it played out time and time again before getting married. Friends who talked about that and cannot trust their husband, feeling as if they're micromanaging or spying on their spouse, or every little thing triggers. And I told myself, I do not want to marry someone with this struggle. So Jared and I talked about it prior to getting married, in dating and engagement. Are you struggling with this? And have you struggled with this in the past? Most men have. Most men. So I knew going in, he probably would have said, yes, I've seen porn, I've watched it, I've struggled with it when I was in my teenage years, whatever it may be. So I didn't go in thinking, oh, he's going to be perfect. I want to marry someone that I've never seen porn before. In an ideal world, sure. But we live in a fallen world, and the reality is he probably has, which he did. He had seen it before. He had struggled with it in his teenage years, but he had actively broken that for many, many reasons. He actively sought to break that habit. But I also want to also mention, I spoke to a friend a couple months back. She was talking about, a couple that she knew who struggled with porn, or the husband struggled with porn. But she was like, how did they not see that this would be an issue in marriage? And I was like, I told her, we make excuses. And we tell ourselves, oh, they're going to break it in marriage, or by the time we're married, they won't struggle with this anymore. But you have to nip it in the bud early on. And if they're making promises in dating, once we're getting married, then I'll stop. That's a huge red flag. That's a major red flag, because at the end of the day, if they struggled with it outside of marriage, in marriage, it just amplifies even more.
Yes.
And I tell people all the time, marriage has shown me the ugly side of me. Things that I thought I dealt with resurfaced and reared its ugly face in a mighty way. So that I want to say, talk and address those issues. Be open with each other if you're dating. Not too open, because also you can cross the line and allow certain things to stir up, but be honest with each other and talk about those issues. And if they struggle with porn, it shouldn't be, and you mentioned this, it shouldn't be, I will deal with it in the future. It should be, I'm dealing with this now, because I don't want to take it into marriage.
Yes.
Yeah. And I agree with you with hearing the Lord's voice. That's a huge, huge one. Going to counseling. I believe that if you are not being mentored by someone, then you're not growing. You have to be mentored by someone. whether that's through a counselor or a spiritual leader. Mentorship allows you to grow because, like you mentioned, they call out the things in you. They ask you the tough questions. But if there's no room for mentorship, then you're stagnant and you're not growing in your walk with the Lord or just growing in general. But so how has your perspective on relationships and intimacy changed since, your whole story?
Yeah. I mean, I've just learned a lot in general about relationships, I think, and how to do that. I think one of the things, actually, oddly enough, that has changed a lot is I feel like God has just really given me a love for and just an understanding for men in general, and a recognition that they are struggling with something. The enemy has, again, comes to steal, kill, and destroy, right? And he has put something in front of them that honestly is really hard from the beginning to deal with.
Yeah.
And so they are up against so much. And so I think just as a woman, not blaming men as a whole, in relationships, but recognizing their struggle and lifting them up, right? And trying to encourage them and help them to grow. And and so I think it just in general, and then not being closed off to relationships, right? And so when I met my fiance, I went into it with the Lord, right? And I knew the risks and the fears and all of that, but I just said, God, if he's the one for me, then I trust you, and guide me in this as we go on dates and as we get to know each other. I just need your help, and I need to know that you're in it, and I need to know if there are red flags and all of those things, and just really leaning on God in that season. And he's just been incredible. And it was so beautiful to me because my fiance, Brian, he had already implemented a lot of the things I've talked about. So the accountability and the mentorship and the counseling, that he's open to, because again, like you said, most men struggle with it today just because of the nature of our world or have seen it. And so he had already taken proactive steps as a man to not struggle with it, and to do things. And I just, those were specific things I had prayed for. And it was just really cool to see that, and so I think, just being a lot more intentional with how I approach those things, and not being jaded, by the circumstances, seeing the beauty of God in everyone, but doing that with wisdom. And so I think maybe I had some naivety at the beginning, and now entering into relationships with maybe more wisdom while still seeing the good.
Yeah. And I hope that's an encouragement to, well, not I hope, I know that'll be an encouragement to listeners, especially for women, that there is hope. There is God's redemptive power in this. And if you're married right now and your spouse is struggling with it, they can break free of that, but it requires humility on their part. It requires a lot of active steps and just doing the work and putting the work in it. They're more than capable, but a key thing that you mentioned is not judging them, not judging at all, because especially as a man, the last thing they need is judgment. Going through something so vulnerable and icky, and it's hard to talk about, especially for males. It's hard for them to open in general. A lot of men were raised to, toughen up. You don't talk about your feelings. Suppress it. You're okay. But for a man to open up and say, hey, this is what I'm struggling with, the last thing they need is for their spouse or for their significant other to say, oh, wow, that's what you struggle with, or judging them or throwing it in their face all the time. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because we have to be compassionate and sensitive walking through issues like this. And I also want to mention, before we wrap this up, I have one last question for you, but I also wanted to mention something that my husband and I talked about prior to getting married, when he told me, he struggled with this, and when he was a teenager, something he asked me was, I want to be able to not have those images for the rest of my life, because, those are images that remain with you. And we prayed that God would remove those images, that he won't just idly be sitting down and then it pops up in his head, because that's what happens. And thankfully, through prayer and fasting, one day we were talking, and it was, I think our first year in marriage. He told me, Vashti, I can't even picture porn
Wow.
in my, and that's because in high school, in his teenage years, he struggled with it, but through his young adult years, he could still, those images would pop up off and on, and he'd have to tell himself, nope, I'm not going to entertain it. I'm not going to go back to that habit. I'm not going to go back to that lifestyle. But he could still have those images pop up. But the fact that through prayer and fasting, the Lord was able to heal his mind, that not even those images, he can even visualize it anymore. That's the power of the Lord.
Wow.
That you don't have to struggle with this for the rest of your life. And he wasn't even struggling with it at that point, in their dating and married years. It was more so the devil, hey, remember this.
Right.
Hey, remember, the image that you saw. And he wanted to not even struggle with being able to visualize it anymore. And God did that for him. God definitely can do that for anyone out there. But again, it requires a humble heart and honesty, complete honesty.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so good. And honestly, I hear those stories a lot from men who know and love the Lord and have prayed, and God has just removed those images. Yeah, that's incredible.
And that's a form of healing that we don't talk about, but that's healing that only the Lord could have done. But
definitely,
my last question I wanted to ask was, what advice would you offer? And this is flipping the script or flipping roles, to individuals who are currently struggling with pornography addiction. You didn't struggle with it, but your ex-husband did. But what would you advise to someone who is struggling with this?
Yeah, great question. And I would definitely say get counseling. Get into the right counselor who deals with this issue, because they're going to know how to help. And then start developing new habits. Build community, do other things, and then build community. There's a great program called Covenant Eyes, and that is where you get an accountability partner. Yeah. And then it gives reports on what you're watching. So there's accountability, because two of the biggest issues in porn use are shame and isolation. And so if you can get out of isolation and into community, that's a big step. And then if you can, as you heal and you deal with the shame, right, and get rid of that, then you can walk in freedom, and you can walk in wholeness, and in the identity of who you are and who you were made to be. Because I really believe that pornography steals our identity. When we're wrapped up in shame and we don't, we're not walking out who we're meant to be. So I think dealing with those things, get it in the light with the right people, with safe people. So make sure that you're getting with the right people. And then go from there. And there's so many amazing programs today too for recovery. There's a lot of them. Fight the New Drug has one called Fortify, and there are others. But accountability is a huge piece of that for sure.
Okay. Cool beans. Well, I'll have all those links, because we do use Covenant Eyes at our church for mentorship programs. My husband mentors a couple guys, and that's one of the key things that they use for that mentorship program. But also, we'll have your book in the description and the link, and I will also be giving away one of your books to one of our listeners this week. So thank you so much, Ellie, for just being vulnerable, for sharing your story, for being brave, and giving hope. We live in a fallen world, but there is hope because we have Jesus. And just super, super impactful story, and I'm so encouraged by it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm so glad to have been here.
Alrighty. Well, we'll hopefully have you on some other time, but that's it for now. Thank y'all for tuning into today's episode. I hope y'all enjoyed our topic. Our topic is very sensitive, very serious, but also one that just needs to be talked about. I think too often we shy away from the topic of porn. We don't enjoy talking about it because it is icky and it's vulnerable. But the reality is so many people struggle with it, and it needs to be addressed. So share, comment, and I will see y'all next week.